Hello, good morning, friends. Thanks a lot for joining this lecture. We are facing some technical issues at the moment. Can I ask you to wait for a few more minutes patiently so that our technical team can fix it as soon as possible? Thank you. Please stay tuned. Okay, we are back up and running. So, first of all, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody present here. I'm Harihar Subramanian, and I'm joined by Karthik to host the meeting today. Before we go into today's topic, I would like to quickly explain in brief who we are and what we do. Sambash is an open community of like minded Indians from different spheres of life, from IT to accounting, from students to retired seniors living in Europe. We come together to discuss the real Indian cash, that is, culture, art, societal issues, and history. With a multitude of mushrooming Indian organizations in Europe, each for their own language, religion, we aim to bring them all together to one common platform to have an open conversation while they continue to operate in complete autonomy. Sambash is derived from the Sanskrit word Sambashan, which means conversation. We believe that our forum will present several opportunities to have Sambash and open conversation. Also, our forum is for those who bash India for its culture and history. We hope to enlighten them with facts and history rather than stories and gossips. Our programs include lectures, debates, concerts, published papers, and many more. We are neither a political organization nor a religious organization. With this, now I would request Karthik to take over and introduce Dr. Koenraad. Thank you.
Thank you, Hari. I would like to welcome you all once again to this talk by Dr. Koenraad Elst. The Indian civilization is counted among the most ancient of civilizations, while its other ancient contemporaries, such as the Greek, Roman, have been digested, to use the word of Sri Raja Malhotra, into religions of medieval times. The Indian civilization continues to evolve by adaptation to human aspirations of respective space and time contours. It therefore continues to be practiced by a majority of population in India, which today accounts to about 10% of the world population. Dharma, which literally means that which sustains, or dharyate iti dharma, and dharmic thoughts have been at the bedrock of this civilization. Today, this dharmic thought is referred to as Hinduism or Sanatana Dharma. To borrow from the observations of the Reverend Master Shatavdani R. Ganesh, if classical art forms are any measure of the continuity of civilizations, even today, classics of Indian origin, such as the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, are a part of every commoner's life in India. Any rendition of these classics attract a lot of interest and attention by one and all. To understand this, part of the success of lockdown in India due to the current pandemic situation can be attributed to retelecasting of the televised versions of these classics on national television. One of the paradigms of continuing globalization has been economic immigration across continents of the world. Immigration for economic reasons into the West can be traced back to the colonial era. In recent decades, this phenomena has found a different purpose, which is essentially skills driven. Many Indian communities have made various geographies they migrate to their homes. They have blended into the local culture as seamlessly as possible, have cared for their fellow citizens as if they were their kin, and in short, nurtured community aspirations in their respective geographies. Statistics of Indian immigrants into the West, say roughly about two generations in the recent past, indicate that the Indian immigrant community have economically, socially, and culturally well integrated. In Europe, the promise of equality, fraternity, and liberty has been given to every citizen. It is solemn and non compromisable. However, some practices of the Hindu community run the risk of coming across to Europeans as superstitious or dogmatic. This often leads to false equivalences and stereotyping from mere geographical or linguistic perspectives, or even run the risk of being cast away as alien. The Hindu way of life is yet to be recognized in Europe. Dictums such as Annam Bahu Kurvita, Tadvratam, Dharmo Rakshati Rakshitaha, Sarve Janaha Sukhino Bhavantu is common knowledge and in fact built into the DNA of the Hindu culture. To adapt, contribute, and make prosperity wherever they live is something that need not be taught explicitly for a Sanatani. As the migrant Hindu population is gearing up to call Europe their home, it is important to set course on a narrative for future European Indians, for future Europeans who are of Indian origin. Pardon. To introduce our speaker, Dr. Koenraad Elst was born on the 7th of August 1959 in Leuven, Belgium. He is said to have embarked on a quest for truth in his late teens, which also brought him to India. He made some seminal contributions through his scholarly research. Mere titles of some of his works should give us goosebumps. If I may read out a few, his dissertation thesis, Decolonizing the Human Mind, Negationism in India, Concealing the Record of Islam, Who is a Hindu, The Problem with Secularism, Ayodhya and After, etc. All Indians need to be indebted to his first class work, which has played its role in several ways, both actively and passively. Dr. Elst happened to be in Varanasi during the thick of things when Ram Janmabhoomi movement was beginning to gather, that is the year 1988-89. Professor Elst, who was drawn to it, made original and independent work in setting a scholarly course to this movement. Professor Shankar Sharan writes in one of his recent articles, A Maharati without a Ratha, which loosely translates to a warrior without a chariot, says, during those times when the movement was rather driven through emotional appeal or from traditional lore, Dr. Elst made some seminal contributions collecting facts towards building a watertight case that could be used to argue in a court of law. The book published in 1991, Ayodhya and After, Issues Before Hindu Society, thoroughly rebuts the claims of Marxist historians. In 1991, the so-called eminent historians had cooked up theories to the effect to calling that Ram temple was never aboriginally there at the Ram Janmabhoomi Sthal. This intervention by the eminent historians, in fact, resulted in the failure of all arbitration attempts, also convened by the then Prime Minister of India, Sri Chandrasekhar. It is now left to the imaginative minds of people who are listening to this, who are going to listen to this talk, what would have happened had the eminent historians got their way out. So thanks to Professor Elst for really making seminal contributions and making and setting the course right for the argument in the Ayodhya Ram Temple case. About the erudite scholarship of Dr. Elst, the learned say there is no left historian who can stand ground in a debate about the Ram Janmabhoomi issue with him. He continues to labor through his scholarship to reason, analyze, and understand the complex ways of evolving aspirations and societal tensions across the world. His recent work, Hindu Dharma and Cultural Wars, published in 2019, stands as an evidence to this. It is indeed a privilege to have Dr. Elst help us understand the dynamics of the current geopolitical cultural landscape in general and Europe in particular through today's lecture. Welcome again, Dr. Elst, and it's over to you. Thank you.
All right, good morning. Namaste. I hope everyone can see me and hear me. Yes?
Yeah.
All right. When I was initiated into yoga in Amsterdam in 1980 by Swami Hariharananda, he told us, "You have come from the long distance for bliss." And so that's how we have gotten together here also. It's been an unlikely journey, but here we are. So I'm going to talk about the readiness of Europe for Dharma. Very many people in India think of Europe as a Christian continent, and of America also. Now, in the case of Europe, at any rate, that is a bit anachronistic. And so in my country, there was a great walkout from the church in around 1970. And I was very much part of that generation. At 14, 15, I stopped going to church. And I thought it was no longer needed. And in fact, I was part of the whole movement of democratization of knowledge, where people started seeing that the basic beliefs of Christianity could not be sustained. Many things that were being done by Christians were acceptable, but the basic beliefs that define Christianity, they could not be upheld. You see, the resurrection was a strange idea, the virgin birth, of course, the fact that by the resurrection, people were saved from sin, from the hereditary sin incurred by Adam and Eve, that this was also linked to mortality, which is why the victory over death by Jesus would save us, would liberate us from sin, and implicitly also from mortality. This was such a funny belief. And so people started questioning it. And so after some pioneers left the church, then more and more people followed. And then the element of conformism also worked. People who went to church before because everybody went, stopped going to church because most people didn't go anymore. So they followed suit. Now that has left what Salman Rushdie has called a God-shaped hole in the European psyche. And so people have tried to fill that hole Or first of all, you see, they started enjoying not not being burdened with a guilty feeling towards the demands that God had supposedly made. But very soon after, you see, this groping for new spiritual roots started. So there were a number of different solutions. And one of them is trying to rediscover the native roots of European spirituality. And that is a movement that I've seen from fairly close, though I'm not entirely part of it. But I look on it with sympathy because, of course, it is a good thing to, putting it in Christian terms, to resurrect a religion that has been murdered, which is the case of all the paganisms native to Europe. So I sympathize with that movement, but I don't expect too much from it. One thing is that simply there's a lack of knowledge. You have some some pagan artwork and so on from the Romans, the Greeks, but you don't know anymore what the spirit behind that was. In the case of Germanic and Celtic religions, we really don't know. We vaguely attribute some spirituality to the Druids, which means mainly that they learned their traditions by heart, but they also did things like practicing human sacrifice. I don't know if we want to revive that. I don't think so. And anyway, we don't know exactly. You see, we have some vague reports by Julius Caesar, but we really don't know. And trying to reconstruct that usually is a matter of a lot of imagination or of common sense, but that common sense is then nurtured by looking around at what spirituality exists in the rest of the world. And then we automatically end up in Asia with people trying to appropriate or interiorize the spiritual traditions of China, Japan, Tibet, Thailand, and especially India. So what you got since the 1960s especially is a lot of interiorization of Indian traditions, either discovered over there, but mostly brought to the West by Indian gurus. And these Indian gurus often themselves try to adapt to the West in different ways. Like some gurus, for example, interiorized themselves a lot of Christianity, the outer forms of Christianity, the character of Jesus, thinking that Westerners needed this. Well, I'm afraid that Westerners themselves have already starting in the 18th century gradually emancipated themselves from this Christian heritage. Others minimize their techniques, their yoga that they came to teach, to make it easier, to make it more digestible. Like you heard about transcendental meditation, where they gave people one mantra, and that was supposed to be a cure for everything. That was one size fits all, and that does considerable injustice to the richness of the yoga tradition. It is also perhaps good for beginners, but very soon people want more. And so that they didn't get from transcendental meditation, but fortunately the movement kept growing and more Oriental gurus came to the West, or Westerners went over there, went to Rishikesh, to ashrams, and brought these yoga traditions back home. So one thing that I noticed, that I have noticed, is having been part of that scene for about 40 years, is a growth in quality. You see, more and more people know more and more about real yoga, know also about the background lifestyle and the background philosophy. For example, one thing that started around 1990 is the introduction of the philosophy of Kashmiri Shaivism. And so this is an old Indian school that became most famous, or that reached its pinnacle under Abhinava Gupta around 1000 AD. And in Kashmir itself, of course, it was more or less lost because of the incursions by Islam. But it was revived around 1990, and many more scholars, both in India and in the West, started studying it. And so it gained a very, very prominent place in the yoga scene in the West. The time is too short to talk about philosophy. Let's talk about real life, how it's really going. A number of ashrams have been set up in the West. Like I know the Kriya Yoga ashram near Eindhoven in the Netherlands. There is one ashram, there's one in the Netherlands, one in London also, of the of Vishwatma Baura. He's well, he's deceased now, but his ashram was and still is in near Chandigarh. There is the presence of the Himalaya yoga tradition from Rishikesh with Swami Veda Bharati, Swami Rama. And so that is gradually being indigenized. One thing I really like, for instance, about this tradition is that you see a coming together of a lot of native Dutch followers with Indian immigrants. You see, that's a very important barrier, this ethnic distinction between native Indians and native Europeans. They often remain separate worlds. You see, usually some Hindu community is either the one or the other. You see, there you more and more see them blending together. You see, that's a very good sign for the future. I should, of course, also mention the ISKCON, the Hare Krishnas. They look very Hindu. They are very explicitly Hindu, although they often, before Western audiences at least, say they are not Hindus. Now, this is a very common problem today with Hinduism. The last decades, Hinduism has had rather negative media. There's a strong anti-Hindu tendency what is nowadays called Hindu phobia. I don't like the term, but the idea, of course, is very real. There is indeed a very negative attitude against Hinduism that wasn't there like 50 years ago. This has to do with Indian politics. It also has to do with the European phenomenon of the uh, acceptance of more and more Muslims and of Islam, so that both the left and even a large part of the churches are becoming fairly pro-Islamic, or very much at least anti the criticism of Islam. And therefore they project this, this sympathy on whatever they hear about India. They hear that there is a conflict between Hindus and Muslims in India. So they say that the Muslims must be the good guys and the Hindus must be the bad guys. This tendency, unfortunately, is quite strong in the media, especially, much less among ordinary people. But still, it's something you have to take into account. Now, nevertheless, in spite of this this surface problem of whether Indian spirituality should call itself Hindu or not, it is a serious question to ask. You see, can you bring Hinduism to Europe, yes or no? Can you call it Hinduism? Now, I think that it makes little sense to stress geography, to stress the country India. You see, you can't bring Indian culture elsewhere. Or you can, I mean, to some extent it has spread like to Southeast Asia. But then again, if you want to spread the important things, then you probably will have to shed some of the outer forms. Like for instance, when Buddhism went to China, it ceased being Indian to a large extent. It became very much Chinese, though of course the texts were Indian, the doctrines came from India, and the Chinese also recognized that. So similarly, what you can get now in Europe is that people recognize these Indian origins. You know, there should not be any form of stealing, of cultural appropriation, as they call it. But nevertheless, what you are going to get is a European form of Dharma, just as you had a Chinese form of Dharma. So in that sense, you know, it is okay to say, oh, but this is not Hindu. This is universal. You see, in a sense, it is universal. When you practice yoga, when you develop your consciousness, well, consciousness is something quite universal. When you try to create peace of mind, well, peace of mind is something that everybody desires. When you concentrate on your breath and do different breathing techniques, well, breathing is something quite universal. So in that sense, you know, you can shed the idea, oh, this is Hindu. On the other hand, you should be careful, because people who insist, oh, this is not Hindu, well, either they mean harm to Hinduism. Like, for instance, in America, you have a movement of Christian yoga, where they try to obscure the Hindu origins completely. So, you know, but as a matter of common knowledge, of course, you see, these Indian origins are being recognized. Like there is a European Union of Yoga, and every year they have a gathering, a week in Zinal in Switzerland. I've been there a number of times. And so there, of course, it is completely recognized as Indian origin. Sanskrit names are used every year. Some masters from India are invited and so on. So this is still a very much an India-based movement. Many teachers over here go to deepen their knowledge in Indian ashrams and so on. So that link with India is still there, but nevertheless, to make it accepted, to really strike roots in Europe, these forms, these outer forms, uh, should not be emphasized. Of course, what is purely outer form and what does logically follow from the essence of Dharma? That is a question. For example, David Frawley emphasizes that it is useful to wear white clothes. Well, I don't know about that. I don't see many Hindus over here wearing Indian clothes. Ladies wear saris, that is true. And that also makes sense. That is something you can defend in the sense that a sari is a very beautiful way of dressing, in the sense that it always does justice to whoever you are. You see, fat ladies become less emphatically fat and thin ladies less emphatically thin, and so on. It's a very nice dress. Nevertheless, you see, it's only what it is. It doesn't matter if you give up these Indian customs and becoming completely Western, as long as the essence is preserved. Now, what about the essence? Uh, we are speaking about Dharma. Now, what is Dharma? Rather than enumerating what Indian sources say about Dharma, let us try to give a logical definition, namely, Dharma is the proper way of relating the parts to one another and the parts to the whole, or rather in the reverse order, relating the parts to the whole and also the parts to the other parts. What does that mean? Well, relating the beings to the whole means what is usually called religion. And the proper relation between the parts and the other parts, that is what is usually called ethics. These two together are dharma. It is wrong, it is a mistake to translate dharma by religion. Religion is something that in our secular states is deemed to be something private. You can have any relation with your maker, with the creator that you want, as long as you don't show it in public. Whereas in public, you're supposed to be ethical, that is to say, you have to observe the proper relations of justice with other beings. Now, in Dharma, these two come together. And in fact, that is the normal thing in the history of mankind. Modern Western secularism, where these two are separated, is a relatively new phenomenon. So, what we call religion is, in the definition of Emile Durkheim, the French sociologist, is essentially awe for the sacred. It's making a distinction between the sacred and the profane. You can compare this with the distinction between heaven and earth. Heaven is unreachable, you can only look up to it, whereas the earth, you are part of that. And this is where the problem for Dharma in a place like Europe really starts. Why? Because whereas religion used to be a universal phenomenon, now for the first time in history, we get a society that doesn't really believe in the sacred anymore. You can compare it with the first landing on the moon. In the first time, for the first time in history, a man set foot on a heavenly body. That is to say, it was demonstrated that space is no different really from the earth. The same natural laws that exist on the earth exist in space and vice versa. So this is a desacralization of the universe, as it is called. And so many people do not just uh, take distance from the specific beliefs of Christianity, but have at once jettisoned the whole idea of religion itself. You know, the whole idea that things are sacred, the world is sacred, or something above the world is sacred, that has all together been jettisoned. The only thing that is important now is the world of men. So for them, it's only ethics that counts. In terms of ethics, of course, the difference between India and Europe is not that big. Many of the things that are deemed valuable, or conversely, the things that are deemed evil, are roughly the same. It is in religion that the difference starts. And there, of course, Hinduism has a far broader view than Christianity ever had. Maybe paganism in the old days had something similar as Hinduism, but again, we are far removed from that. So to an extent, we will have to rediscover religion for ourselves, or we will have to borrow it in the East. And so that is happening to quite an extent. But still, many people are like, one factor, for instance, is they are too proud to take something from somewhere else. They're willing to practice certain exercises because they're told that because of these exercises, you can relieve your high blood pressure, or you get calm and more peaceful and so on, or you can focus better on your work, all these practical things. But they get a bit, full of suspicion once you start talking about Shiva or so. Then they think, oh, this is a cult. I have to stay away from this. I don't want to be part of this. Well, there you see, Hinduism has a solution in the sense that it is very open-ended. It doesn't want you to believe anything specific. You can grow, you can start from where you are and gradually grow and evolve in your sense of the spiritual, of higher realities. And so that, I think, is a process that I see happening. People are outgrowing the confines of their Christian beliefs and are gradually rediscovering what Dharma has to offer. I'm going to leave it here for my own talk. I would like to now interact with Hindus living in Europe.
Uh, Dr. Els, thanks for this explication of the position of dharma. Yeah, so there were very interesting points that you made. To my mind, the fact that Hinduism or Sanatana Dharma is an open, or the way of Dharma is open and doesn't have to be dogmatic, is definitely one thing. However, as people who are immigrants in Europe, to some of our colleagues in our day-to-day life with practicalities, there are things that we find very hard to remove the prism of, let's say, the preconceived notions on us. For example, if I tell them that I'm not going to consume alcohol, or I'm not a meat eater, although meat eating is not eating meat is more accepted here because of the vegan fashion that has come out today. But still, not telling them that I don't eat meat seems to be, kind of trying to. We are kind of, how do I say that? We are kind of socially not so acceptable if you don't consume alcohol and drink meat. We are not one among them many a times in gatherings and so on. So how do we explain that this is the case, not because of a religion or some preconceived notion, but it's an individual choice being a Sanatan?
Well, I would like to know your experience about this, but my impression is that different lifestyles are fairly easy to explain in Europe, because Europeans themselves have a number of different lifestyles. There is not one norm for all Europeans. I mean, like you mentioned, vegetarianism. You see, vegetarianism is a movement that already existed in Europe, especially in Germany, since certainly the early last century, maybe earlier. But at any rate, that did not come from India. You see, there was an idea of back to nature, certainly in medicine, already indigenous in Europe. Then when people discovered India, that became strengthened. And I mean, these two are intertwined. Like, you have a movement called anthroposophy, started by Rudolf Steiner century ago. Now, he himself had been the head of the German department of the Theosophical Society, which was a mixture of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Christianity. And so that way, you see, much Indian influence already came into a movement that is otherwise deemed very European. I mean, part of the inspiration was European, was Goethe, for example, the German poet, was also a philosopher, but much of it was Indian, and these two got mixed, and so. But Europeans are used to the fact that these movements exist. Like, you have a school network of Steiner schools of this anthroposophical movement. Similar with teetotalism. You see, some people don't drink, and that also has always existed. So, as an Indian, you can easily become part of these movements, or present yourself as another movement, but similar to those. So the fact of being a bit special is not that unusual.
Right. So that also is subtly related to what I wanted to perhaps ask you originally. So, I mean, it seems as though we have to fall into one of the preset categories. It's hard to. So should we then belong to one of these schools that were started here to be calling ourselves vegetarians, so that we can relate to the other Europeans, or can we just say that it's my thought We have not been eating meat for several generations in the past. We just
Mhm.
decided at one point in time, and then we just stopped doing it. Although that's very acceptable to many of the right-thinking people, there are still raised eyebrows. For instance, one person who was at the cafeteria asked, when I asked, it's my personal experience I'd like to share. When I told the person that I'm not going to eat fish, meat, and I also checked if the fries were fried with lard or with sunflower oil, for instance. And then she was really aghast, and she said, "Oh, you have grown this big without having one piece of meat all your life?" And that was the kind of reaction I got, and I kind of a little embarrassed in front of everybody. Anyway, so that, but it's good to know that there are already schools of thought which toe these lines, and I'm happy to know that. So that's definitely useful. So moving on to the next question. Um,
Well, one more thing about the last question.
yeah,
Um, this situation forces you to make a distinction between what am I doing it for, and the fact that you see in your life in India this was normal.
right,
You know, when you're here in new circumstances, you know the customs existing around you are not important anymore. Then you have to really define for yourself what are you doing it for.
right,
And so the reasons for vegetarianism are perfectly sustainable in Europe too, not in the name of, you know, maintaining an Indian custom, but in the name of being considerate to animals, you know, looking after your health and so on.
right,
And so those things are perfectly understandable to Europeans and are indeed put in practice by a number of Europeans.
right, right,
So, you know, that's very important. I mean, in the case of, you know, maintaining tradition, it's not a matter anymore of maintaining what your parents did and so on. You are in a new world,
mhm,
but it, you know, you can still do it in the sense of practicing what it originally was meant for.
right. Yeah, so that's where probably we also have to educate a little ourselves to explain things. But yeah, I agree with the point that we are in a new circumstance, and that calls for another
Mhm.
explanation. Sure, definitely. So moving on to the next one, I have a question from the audience here. Um, Most anthropologists are leftist or pro-Islam. Why should we change this? How do we change this? Why is, I think, very well understood, or why is a question that we all keep asking. We have several answers perhaps, but it's good to know from you. And how do we change this is something that you probably can dwell upon in greater detail.
Yeah, it's a real question because for decades already, I personally have tried to break through the wall of disinformation about India.
Mhm.
I can't say I've gotten very far. In fact, I'd say that the last year, the Hindu bashing in the media has only gotten worse.
Mm. Yeah, agree.
And like about the riots in Delhi, you know, described here in the media as pogroms and things like that.
Right.
Uh, it's um, it's a real problem. You see, the solution, of course, is knowledge. If you are properly informed about Hinduism and also about the situation of Hinduism in India, that takes away much of these negative judgments. But the enemy, and I don't consider anyone an enemy, but they themselves do, and they treat Hinduism that way. Um, they have very much built up their disinformation machine. You see, there used to be a bottleneck in the information about India, which they controlled. Now, today with the internet, there should be less of that. And, you know, here on my computer, I can read all these online pro-Hindu media that are still marginal in India, but that at any rate exist and can perfectly be accessed over here, like Swarajya, like India Facts, like Pragyata, and so on. And so it is strictly speaking possible to get the right version about India, but nobody is interested enough, or very few people. And so they lap up what little their newspaper tells them, and what their newspaper over here tells them is straight copied from the usual suspects in India itself. So what people here don't realize is that they get to consume the propaganda put out by one particular camp in India. And, they don't know. And so I am trying to break through that, but it is a very uphill battle.
Indeed.
And so you see there, I mean, Hindus have to themselves do what they can. Ultimately, we're going to win this, but it may take some more time.
Right. So it is often said, I heard this, I can't remember from who, that you are heartless if you are not a communist in your teens, and and you're brainless if you continue to be one after your teens. So
Yes,
somebody
of
told that,
course.
and
Now, that in fact describes myself.
uh-huh.
Um, I was on the left when I was young, and not so much anymore now. Uh, but I think in a way that's a self-flattery, because when I think back of those days, I think that the the fellow students who were not on the left, I used to look down on them. I thought they were backward and so on. Actually, they were right. And so, you have to admit that perhaps being young and leftist, was perhaps understandable, but was not so bright at all.
Right. So I mean, linking to that is the question where it seems not that people are not interested in India. It seems not that people are not interested in dharmic ways, the people of the West, but it just seems that there is some kind of a smoke screen created by the no religion people, or uh, the communist people who subscribe to communistic views of the world, the Marxists and the Maoists and people like that, uh, who seem to kind of create all kinds of confusion. So there must be a good way to break through this confusion with straight and pointed arguments. And could you help us know more about such resources so that we can educate ourselves?
Such resources.
Such resources which can cut through the cloud of confusion that is generally created by a lot of Marxism, and uh, things like what uh, if there is a development plan, there are people who come and put their flags and say, no, that is capitalism, will not let it succeed. For example,
Mm.
infrastructure growth, or setting up of power plants that have happened across in India. I'm sure I remember to have seen one, I can't recollect the name, but I remember to have seen one for an atomic energy company in France, which was given a real thorn in the flesh by the activists. I'm not taking
Mm.
sides here, but although there is an apparent requirement for an infrastructure for the luxury that the modern day science gives, uh, there is always a lopsided view in the terms of there is no balance in their worldview, and there seems to be some kind of a protest for the sake of protest. And listening to them seems like they are taking out legitimate cause on the skin, but down deep, you can easily see that there is no sense of balance in their
Mm.
arguments. So one needs to definitely cut through this cloud of confusion, I would call. And
Yes, but this confusion is quite artificial. You see, is kept up with a lot of effort, and people who live their lives, who have practical problems to face and so on, are much less tempted by that. You see, the media create a very artificial world.
Mhm.
In India, you have the reality that this, ugly, vicious character Narendra Modi
Mhm.
has achieved quite a bit that makes a very positive difference in the lives of people.
Mhm.
I mean, imagine the lockdown, for families who have no toilet.
Mhm. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
see, there was a very
Perfect.
practical thing to do
Exactly.
of Narendra Modi to bring toilets to people. And the promise has not been entirely fulfilled, but certainly, a lot of distance has been covered, a lot of difference has been made. And so, and it is perhaps also because he himself has a background of poverty. You see, privileged people like Rahul Gandhi don't know what ordinary people are really longing for, what really concerns them. And so there, you see, Modi has done some practical things that really, really were very good. And um, in India, you see, the leftism has always been a very artificial thing if you compare with the Indian diaspora communities. Um,
Right.
they went to places like Kenya, like South Africa, and so on, and immediately became rich or became well-to-do. They went to England, America. In America, they are the richest immigrant community, and so on. So that's normal for Hindus. They shine when they can. But in India, they were kept down by this Nehruvian socialism. I mean, it's really unbelievable. Of course, India had been impoverished to some extent by the British who exploited India. Then during the Second World War, the Indian economy was given a great boost because it was the great production center of the Allies in Asia. And so it had a good start. I mean, if you compare it with the destruction of Germany and Japan and the Soviet Union or of Korea, those countries started again after they had been destroyed. They built themselves up again, whereas India didn't go anywhere for decades under Nehru and Indira. They completely stifled the natural energies of the people. And so Narasimha Rao changed that. And immediately, although many of the controls, the license, permit, Raj, as they say, was still in place, already you see a little whiff of freedom, and already they started advancing. So you see, what Modi did to a large extent is not so much taking an initiative and doing something for people. No, it is letting people come out, let them flourish on their own rather than keeping them down. So it's just the way of nature. And so this leftism is a very artificial thing. Let me give another example. Not from India, but from the West. You see, nowadays you have a lot of, what is called grievance studies in our universities, where they pit women against men, where they pit blacks against whites and so on. Now, this is a fairly artificial thing because in real life, uh, men and women still have normal relations. Blacks and whites can be friends and so on. So, this leftism is a very artificial thing. And, you already do a lot by just living a normal life. Then, of course, then, you have to point out where to go wrong in the appropriate forums.
Mhm.
But this is not a really very big problem.
Yeah, indeed. So, India has been long, several Indians actually have been long calling for the so-called truth and reconciliation setup to be made by the government, and set things right, set the record right. There is no more appeasement, no more glossing over history, no more negationism, as you have put it very aptly, and so
Mhm.
on. Yeah, that's definitely something that I think will help forward to see through the cloud of confusion, I would say.
Mhm.
Great. So let's move on to the next question here. Um, so, um, so we have one audience asking us, or let me combine these two questions together. So there is an acceptance. So this is probably to understand the psyche of how the West see Indian cultures. It seems that Buddha and people like Mahavira are perfectly acceptable, but not Shakti, not Shiva, not the various forms of Vishnu with several arms and so on. So there's a certain way, if presented, that the West would accept, and certain other ways that they are not open to. I suppose that's what the question is about. And to club with that, another question is, how do we then make people see through all these things? Let's say with Ekam Sat Vipraha Bhuta Vadanti dictum, and really live in harmony with each other's ideas. How do we? How do you think we should approach this issue?
Well, the idea of Ekam Sadvi Prabhahudha that is pretty much part of modern culture. Um, so that's not a very novel idea. I mean, that's liberal, so to speak. So you can be open-minded and accept whatever. But so the attitude in Europe will mostly be okay. We don't trouble you if you want to believe in a god with four arms and riding a rat or a tiger or so. We're not going to stop you, but we're not going to do this either. So there is a certain cultural distance that perhaps will not be bridged, or it may be. I mean, after a while,
After a long time,
and
yeah.
if this is all properly explained,
Mm.
because after all, Christians have also been believing funny things for centuries after being seriously indoctrinated in them. So I mean, if you teach, why what these things mean, yes, you can make it more acceptable. But for the time being, people think it's a bit funny, a bit bizarre, a bit colorful on the bright side, but not something that they feel would appeal to themselves. And the question suggests to me, as I understand it, that the questioner wants these things to be accepted. Now, I don't know, you see, they come naturally. You see, once you get the essential things accepted, then maybe there'll be a readiness for those things too. But so I think these outer forms are just not really the issue.
Right. Yeah. So you also mentioned in your talk that the outer forms might have to be let go of to keep the essentials. So
That's
when,
why that's why in the West Buddhism is far more popular,
uh-huh.
because with Buddhism uh, they think over here that it's not really a religion. Though if you look at Tibetan Buddhism or so, it has most of the trappings of religion.
Mhm.
But at any rate, it looks rational. The Buddha wasn't busy with these gods and so on, and so they like that better. You know,
Right.
my philosophy professor in Varanasi used to say that Buddhism is Hinduism for export.
Yeah.
And so it
Indian.
is only now that Hindus physically come and settle in the West that there is room for greater acceptance of Hinduism. It'll take some time still, but I mean, it's more acceptable now than it was like in the 60s.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Indeed. In fact, Hinduism, in the broad definition of some of the Hindu acts I heard from Sai Deepak in one of his talks, was that anything that is not Muslim, Christian, or Farsi is Hinduism. in the Indian laws. That's one of the
Yes, of course.
interpretations that comes out. So that gels very well with the fact that Buddhism was an export version of Hinduism, indeed. Right. I have another interesting related question here. So could one of the reasons for this phenomena be that the idea of sacredness in Hinduism or in the Dharmic tradition, is it any different? And as a corollary to that question, is Buddhism closer in definition to the Abrahamic religions? Is the reason why the West tends to agree or come to terms with Buddhism faster than the rest of the Hinduism?
Well, no, on the contrary. Buddhism, as it is understood here mostly, which is through books, so it's the theory of Buddhism, and therefore more ideal and more modern than Buddhism is in practice in places like Thailand. Is that, you see, it's without religion. And you see, this is not a Western deformation. When you go to the Buddha's original teachings, gods are not important in there, even though Buddhist monks have brought the Hindu pantheon all the way to Japan, for example, where you have temples for Saraswati. But nevertheless, it's not so important. You see, when the Buddha asks you to do things, it's not so much to go back to those gods. No, it is to practice Buddhist meditation. And so that is like more acceptable. You don't have to believe in anything. May I remind you also, in 2005, there was a political problem in Cambodia, where under the influence of Christian missionaries, the education ministry was about to put out textbooks saying that religion is a matter of worshiping God. Now that was a red flag to the Buddhist establishment. No God here. And so they emphasize that what religion does in people's lives. I mean, you can argue about the meaning of the word religion, but you see, that hole that is being filled by religion, that need not be about God. And so God is a specific belief, but Buddhism does without it. And if on occasion you see lay Buddhists can take a religious attitude, well, that's strictly, that is like a child, you see. If they're practicing Buddhism, they are on their way to enlightenment, but you see, in the early stages, they still do what they consider childish things. And so, with that understanding, educated Westerners take to Buddhism precisely because there they just can concentrate on the spiritual practices and not bother about any being above them. This is also a sensitive point for the anti-authoritarian generation to which I belong. Those who did walk out of the church and so on. This idea is very important, that, surrender to some higher being that's undignified, that you shouldn't do. So you shouldn't worship God. That's why, today this is less, but in my own days, this was very strong, the idea of atheism as, in a way, a liberating thing, that there's nobody above you to tell you what to do. And that has a certain value. And there's something heroic about atheism, that there's nobody up there to care for you, that you really have to take responsibility fully, and that there's nobody going to reward you or punish you. So that's also a valid viewpoint. That's part of the the many viewpoints that the wise ones cherish.
Yeah, indeed. That also kind of brushes some of the tenets of Advaita, where the focus is on self-control, the control of the mind, not necessarily in oblation, but in understanding the true behavior of your own self, asking the question, who am I? And realizing the real I in I. That, I mean, if that is the interpretation of atheism, then I think that's perfectly filling in the shoes of the dharmic tradition, I believe. Great. So I have another question here. Something they. Oh, okay, sorry, that was not very clear. So let's shift gears a bit and try to understand your times. We were probably very young, most of us here. At least I was very young to even understand what Ram Janmabhoomi was when it all gathered smoke. And now we understand that the court case has drawn so long, we get to read some of the reports and work back a bit in the history. But we'd like to know from you your first-hand experience, how it was gathering, and what was the kind of what made you interested in it, and what were the critical arguments you think that really clenched the argument?
Yeah. Well, I have no emotional investment in this, in the sense that, well, I don't much care for temples. It's only later that I've seen what beautiful centers of cultural life and so on they can be. Also, the question of reclaiming temples, well, I mean, I shrug at the idea. You know, over here you have neo-pagan movements who reclaim cathedrals from the church, saying, you know, this was built on a pagan temple. Often they were, you know, but I don't know. But in the case of Ram Janmabhoomi, it's not a matter of a temple, it's a place. You see, you can build a temple anywhere, but you cannot change your place of birth. And so, you know, if you care for Rama and his place of birth, well, then it is this place, not any other. And so there reclaiming becomes meaningful. Then, you know, what attracted me to this was simply that I saw that, you know, there was a ridiculous lie being peddled by the eminent historians, namely that there had never been a temple there. And so I felt challenged, you know, that, oh my God, you see, let's prove them wrong. Now, at that time, you see, I thought it was a big job and it was something worthy of me, you know, to do. I thought, you see, you know, I had all this education and now finally I can use it. But actually, it was not so difficult at all. You see, to say that there was a temple, there was a matter of consensus until a few years before. And already there had been excavations by B.B. Lal also confirming materially that indeed, you see, there had been a temple there. So it was so obvious. Now, when debating the issue, there was a scholars debate in 1990-91. And so then many more documents were discovered. And so that's nice. I mean, that's good. But ultimately, that only confirmed what we already knew. But there was this strange paralysis, this hypnosis, that suddenly everybody fell in line saying, oh no, there was never a temple there. This is a Hindutva concoction. Yeah, and including Western academia. I mean, in 90, there was, in my home university in Leuven, Belgium, an edition of the Ramayana conference. And so there, I spoke about this temple issue and how obviously there had been a temple at the site. Well, I was vomited out by quite a few professors there. And that has remained their attitude. And none of them is now saying sorry because they misinformed the public, you know, not knowing very well themselves, you know, just reproducing whatever they heard from the eminent historians. Um, but and their attitude now is to simply look the other way, never to mention it again. For example, in a local newspaper here, there was a long article a few weeks ago about history revision in India. And so it has this fable that the Modi government wants to reform the textbooks and so on. I know from very close quarters that there is no such initiative. I mean, there is a clamoring among some of the Hindutva supporters, but the government is not doing anything about it. But anyway, what struck me in this article, which is a fixed thing, you see, if you want to whip up hate against Hindus, that story always does it, to say that they want to falsify history, that they want to take revenge on the Muslims for, doing all these things. This time, there was no reference to Ayodhya anymore. You see, that used to be the crowning piece. You see, look what these ugly history rewriters do. They even demolished the Babri Masjid. That was totally absent now. And that is precisely because the eminent historians and all their followers realized that they lost this battle, that, the fact that they were wrong has been completely exposed. Now for them, the thing to do is just to not draw attention to this.
Shoot and scoot.
Yeah.
That's one of the tactics that's used. Indeed, it's very heartening to actually listen to this story. I tend to remember a song by Purandaradasa, which says, "This is not the time for good people," and it has been like that for ever. Everybody, including Lakshmana in Valmiki Ramayana, says, "Oh God, oh Rama, you are such a kind and benevolent person. Kaikeyi should not have done this to you. It is not the time for good people," and so on.
Yes, but what I like to hear you say, what you said very aptly, is that it has always been like that.
Yeah, indeed.
We often fall prey to this tendency of thinking that this is a very special time.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's so special.
Yeah, swimming against the tide at times or standing for truth has its own negative sides like this, as in, So indeed. So to conclude, maybe with last question here. There are a lot of efforts, including you, and there are people like Rajiv Malhotra. There are several other professors, including Professor Sharan, people who are associated with Voice of India. And then there is a large corpus of work by likes of Sri Sitaram Goel, Sri Ram Swarup, P.V. Kane, and so on. I shouldn't be taking their names in such a flurry, but they're all great people, just to indicate that there's a large corpus of work. Also, to begin with, Sri Dharampal, who speak about dharma, who speak about the evolution of dharma, and so on. So how do you think, so is it at all possible to spread this word in terms of, let's say, small chunks of knowledge nuggets that could be shared? So can we do some kind of a cherry picking to present to the current generation or the current audience to get them interested in their own lives, in the uddhara, or in their emancipation of their own lives by the way of dharma? If we have to do that, how would we choose? What would we choose, and what would be the, let's say, the top 5 things that you would recommend us to do?
Well, start with the present situation. You see the corona lockdown. This highlights some very useful practices within Hinduism, starting with Namaste. You've seen these pictures of world leaders like Netanyahu, like Prince Charles, and so on. doing namaste because they couldn't shake hands anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a good idea to resource yourself and see what the use is of these Hindu purity rules. You see, many of them make a lot of good sense. Like for instance, um, not even touching your own skin, let alone your body orifices, except if you immediately wash your hands. I mean, that's something that they now say in the Corona craze.
Yeah. So Indriya Shaucha Nigraha is as old as Manusmriti for
Yes, of course.
for those who don't know in the audience. Right.
So
Please,
I mean,
please carry
those
on.
things make good sense, and I mean these hygienic practices completely tie in with the whole health philosophy, with a lot of Ayurvedic rules. Like for instance, you should only eat during the daytime. You should not get up, and for a good dharmic person, you should get up at 4. The day of the gods starts at 4. Yet you see till 7, 8 o'clock you don't eat. You may have a little hot drink, and by a hot drink I don't mean an alcoholic drink. I mean tea.
Yeah.
Um, but so you eat only in the daytime. Also in the evening you don't eat anymore. And indeed, you see, doctors say the best thing to do is not to eat for 4 hours before you go to sleep. So those practices are really make sense. In the 60s, 70s, there was this idea of selling Hinduism to the West um, on the plea that it was scientific. Now, you have to be careful with this. Don't apply it blindly. But you see, with these practices, you can say, yes, they are scientific. They're age old, but somehow our ancestors had it right. On the other hand, if you want to practice, your four-armed gods and so on, there, that may be more difficult. Like there was a court case against the transcendental meditation people who wanted their thing to be practiced in schools, saying that it's scientific. And indeed, it is scientific to practice meditation. It has a lot of objective benefits. Because it leave out the essence, namely enlightenment, but even you see the collateral benefits are very much there. Like for instance, Daniel Dennett, an atheist philosopher, he came to Antwerp here sometime, and so I asked him what he thought about meditation. And much to my surprise, he said that he practiced meditation himself. But he said, not that I attach any metaphysical meaning to it, but it's good against my high blood pressure, right? So meditation is a good thing, nevertheless. This Christian group who had started the trial, they took some texts of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, where there is talk about Brahma and Vishnu and so on. So the judge said, hey, what is scientific about that? And so that's harder to explain, or you have to have a high level of knowledge. But anyway, so quite a few things within Hinduism are objective, are rational. And so that should certainly be highlighted.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. It seems to me that we moved from the dark ages into the age of religion, and then now we are in the age of science. I hope soon we will be in the age of dharma, where we don't blindly do anything, or we do anything just because it's an ism, but we really believe and consciously do things. Thank you, Professor. Thanks a lot for the time you have spent with us. I'm sure there were several other questions that we could not pick up, and we will surely have another round of.
Okay.
We'll collect the questions, formulate another topic for discussion. We'll have another discussion like this in the future, in the near future, if not very far. So thanks a lot. And I apologize to the viewers for having started late. There were some technical glitches that happened. Um, and having gone, and thanks a lot for sitting through this patiently and following us discuss and also the professor's talk. And I also hope here that we have learned quite a bit today, and we leave this enriching in our minds and with a lot of ideas and things to do. Thank you so much. We'd like to end this with a Shanti mantra. Purnamadah Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Thank you. Namaste.